So, my name is Bill Gartner. I'm a senior lecturer and research scientist in the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today I'm going to present a little bit of our research on the ancestral field systems of the Menominee in a presentation entitled Furrows Beneath the Forest, Ancestral Menominee Agriculture and its Implications for the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin's Food Sovereignty Initiative. This is the first of 6 interrelated videos that presents our research. It basically introduces our research questions and talks a little bit about how we're getting the data that we're getting. It will be followed by site-specific reports and then finally a conclusion, Ancestral Gifts for a Sustainable Future. Our research is part of the Menominee Cultural Museum's Culture Camp program. Culture Camp is a Menominee culture, history, and language immersion program, and archaeology is but one small part of it. The participants work with us in the field in both field and laboratory settings as full and equal partners, and we really learn quite a bit from one another. Our research suggests that ancestral Menominee peoples are the original organic and sustainable agriculturalists in Wisconsin. And we can infer a lot of their practices from the soil science and from the archaeology, but we can only learn so much from those particular kinds of techniques. As part of the Culture Camp program, one of the things that we do is we take our information from soil science and from archaeology, and we actually put them to use in a heritage garden that's been built on the Menominee Cultural Museum property. And here we get a full-fledged experiential understanding of what Menominee agriculture was all about. How did ancestral Menominee peoples clear the forest? How did they prepare the soil? How did they build raised fields? What did they grow? What are some of the social dimensions of agriculture? What are some of the words for crops and for other elements of the environment? This is an opportunity where we can all learn from one another. My colleague, Dave Overstreet, and I, we contribute just a little bit to this, a little bit from soil science and a little bit from archaeological perspectives, but the real learning comes in when we get all of this experience, all of this culture, all of this language together, and this is what the Culture Camp provides. A little bit of background about Wisconsin raised fields. Raised fields are planting surfaces that have been elevated above the natural level of the ground. They come in 2 general field patterns in Wisconsin. The first is colloquially known as corn hills, and these are circular hillocks, as illustrated in this archival photograph of the corn hills on the Carroll College grounds. And they also come in these beautiful linear and curvilinear features known as ridged fields or garden beds, as shown in this archival photograph of the Ulrich Farm site in Winnebago County. Now, Wisconsin has more relict raised field sites than any other area north of the Rio Grande of Wisconsin. This is primarily an accident of settlement, but it also indicates the skills of ancestral Menominee and Ho-Chunk peoples in cultivating a diverse array of environments throughout Wisconsin. What you're looking at here on this particular map is the number of raised field sites by county. This map's a little bit out of date. We found many additional sites here in northeastern Wisconsin. I'm in the process of updating this map now. Okay, so let's get into some of our research on the Menominee Reservation. The Menominee Reservation is located in northeastern Wisconsin. You can actually see the boundaries of the Menominee Reservation from space, and that's because the Menominee Reservation is home to the oldest continuously operating sustainable forestry operation in the world. This is incredibly important for our story because the sustainable forestry practices of the Menominee have left the ground surface intact. This means that surface features, including raised fields, storage pits, house basins, and mounds, are all intact. If you know how to read the forest floor, you can actually see the settlements and fields of ancestral Menominee peoples. Now, our story actually begins with the treaties. Menominee peoples once called most of eastern Wisconsin, as well as the Upper Peninsula, home. As shown on this map on the right-hand side of the slide, they were forced in a series of treaties to cede their ancestral homelands. The area in green here marks the current boundaries of the Menominee Reservation. In exchange for ceding most of their traditional homelands, Menominee peoples were supposed to receive from the U.S. federal government payments as well as goods and services over a protracted period of time. Some of those goods and services were related to agriculture. However, the U.S. federal government was more interested in Euro-American style agriculture than traditional Menominee agriculture. And so they sent an agricultural commission, a quote unquote panel of experts, to the Menominee Reservation in order to do an assessment of Menominee people's agricultural prospects. This quote unquote panel of experts came to a rather dismal set of conclusions. Soils they found were sandy, acidic, and infertile. In other words, they were really quite poorly suited for Euro-American style agriculture. Many of the site settings were inundated, that is, they frequently flooded during the spring or during large rainstorm events. The climate, the growing season more specifically, was really quite short and was another source of discouragement. They came to the conclusion that there's a few places that are more poorly suited for agriculture than the Menominee Reservation. This assessment must have come as quite a surprise to a couple of the signatories to the treaties, that is Kanippeway and Kamanakan, whose villages had extensive agricultural fields. And so we come to our two research questions. Is it true that Menominee ancestors were but little acquainted with the arts of civilization, that is, farming? Is the Menominee Reservation truly an almost worthless place to engage in the cultivation of the soil? To find out, tune into the next set of videos. The first site we're going to take a look at is the Shapashikum Fields. And as a reminder, this is the second of 6 video presentations. The Shapashikum site is located on the floodplain of the Wolf River. As part of this conference, we were originally supposed to go and tour these sites and view them in person. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do so. So this is just a couple of images for you to get an idea of what the Shapashikum site looks like. So the Shapashikum site is located, as I mentioned before, on a floodplain of the Wolf River. It's completely underneath the forest here. Here's our field map from the Shapashikum site. The raised fields extend for approximately a kilometer along the banks of the Wolf River. Mounds, storage pits, are located on higher elevation surfaces within the Wolf River Valley. We have no village site associated with this, but rather small scatters and clusters of households in and amongst the fields here. Here's a picture of the Shapashikum fields showing you what the garden beds look like, or the raised fields look like here, once the forest floor is cleared. We were really quite fortunate to find the original surface of the ground at the Shapashikum site. What you're looking at here is a shot of our excavations in progress. This is an excavation block, a small segment of the original surface of the ground that we left in place in order to take samples. Now, this is a plan view photograph of this particular excavation block, and there's a couple of things I'd like to point out here. First of all, you can see that there's a lot of charcoal that is distributed throughout the matrix here. There's also these little reddish-brown oxidized soil patches, and again, they're relatively evenly distributed throughout the matrix here. And this tells us quite a bit about how ancestral Menominee peoples initially prepared the land surface for agriculture. Now, when you have sandy, acidic, and infertile soils, the proper burn is something that's critically important for a successful agricultural operation. Why is that? Well, first of all, the soils are acidic, and what ash will do is it will raise the pH of the soil so that it becomes optimal for crop growth. Secondly, the ash and charcoal are going to provide critical nutrients for crop growth. So, for example, ash is rich in phosphorus and in calcium and in magnesium. These are very important elements for crop growth. The charcoal is going to provide carbon. Certain kinds of charcoal, and we'll talk about this later, can actually set up a very favorable microenvironment for soil microorganisms. Soil microorganisms in turn can liberate phosphorus from the soil, can fix nitrogen from the air, and these are critically important elements for crop growth. A proper burn is important for controlling weeds. A proper growth is critically important for controlling insects and pests. In short, you need to have a proper burn in order to farm sandy, acidic, infertile soils, such as those found on the Menominee Reservation. And the Shapashikum site indicates that ancestral Menominee peoples knew how to do that proper burn. Moreover, they were preparing this landscape really quite early on. The radiocarbon dates, we took some of the charcoal here, we submitted it for radiocarbon dates, indicate that the Shapashikum fields were initially built around 800 AD. To date, this is the earliest radiocarbon date from a raised field in the mid-continent. We did find some ceramics at the Shapashikum site from the fields themselves, and we did find a house basin nearby. They both produce Point Sauble Collard and Hinds Creek styles of pottery. My colleague, Dave Overstreet, will talk a lot more about pottery. Raised fields are really quite dynamic environments. They're built and they're rebuilt through time. And this can be really quite a difficult thing to document while you're in the field here. When we were excavating at the Shapashikum site, we ran into buried planting surfaces, and you can see some of those planting surfaces in this particular image here. So take a look at these darker colored deposits. These darker colored deposits are in fact the old planting surfaces, and you'll notice that we have one planting surface that's going in one direction, and we have another planting surface that meets it almost at a perpendicular angle. Now we excavate these fields in about 5 centimeter levels, and we do maps and photographs, and it's really quite fortunate that we do so. When we were coming down on these superimposed planting surfaces, we didn't initially recognize them. We did capture them in the photographs, and we did capture them in our mapping, but we didn't initially see them when we were excavating them. We were wondering if in fact the Shapashikum fields might have been reoriented through time. You don't want to make too much of a big deal on one excavation unit, but this was certainly really quite an interesting one. We happened to get this one particular picture here where we caught a couple of different excavation units, and notice this kind of undulation, right, that we see between the dark colored and the reddish brown colored deposits in this unit, and you'll notice the same kind of thing here as well. Do we in fact have superimposed fields? In order to see if the fields had in fact been reoriented, we put in a pretty long excavation unit in 2018 and 2019. And our excavations clearly show that ancestral Menominee peoples reoriented their raised fields. Oldest on the bottom, youngest on top. What you can see in this longitudinal cross-section here are a series of dark deposits. Note how they undulate. These are the buried raised fields. They were oriented east-west. That is, they're actually coming out of the screen towards you. East-west oriented fields at this particular location would have been perpendicular to the Wolf River Channel. So when ancestral Menominee peoples built the initial fields at the Shapashikum site, the orientation of the ditches is such that during the spring floods or during a very large rainstorm event, the water would drain from the site to the Wolf River. So one of the initial reasons to build raised fields at this location was to provide site drainage. Sometime later in time, the fields were reoriented so that they were north-south. So here's the planting surface that you can actually walk across at the Shapashikum site. You can see that it's oriented north-south here. The north-south orientation of the ridges means that the ditches are parallel to the Wolf River floodplain. This means during the spring floods or during a large rainstorm event, what would happen is that the water would sit in the ditches, seep into the soil. In essence, the newest configuration of raised fields would have stored water at the site. Again, we excavate these units in about 5 centimeter levels, and we do a lot of photographing and a lot of mapping and a lot of note-taking along the way. And one of the reasons we do this is to have a better understanding of how the fields were built. So here at the Shapashikum site, perhaps you can see slightly darker deposits here, slightly lighter deposits here. Here, you can see the boundary between what I'm talking about here. And as we map these things out and reconstruct them in 3 dimensions, it allows us to understand how ancestral Menominee peoples actually reoriented the east-west fields into the north-south ones. And essentially what they did was to take portions of the east-west fields and essentially move them over, connecting adjacent east-west fields in order to form a north-south ridge. Our next site is the Joe Dick Road site. And as a reminder, this is the third of 6 videos. The Joe Dick Road site is located along a very small tributary to the Wolf River. The Joe Dick Road site is huge. Take a look at this particular aerial photograph in order to get a better idea of both the extent of the site as well as its environmental setting. This area here are lowlands, and in fact this is a pretty extensive marsh. We have fields that go all the way to the marsh edge here. This was the extent of the site as it was recorded in 1999. Jeff Greeno, a Menominee forester, found additional fields scattered throughout the comparatively rugged uplands in 2012 and 2013. All told, the Joe Dick Road site, the fields there cover several square kilometers of ground. We have arbitrarily divided the Joe Dick Road site into east and west components. The east component is in the lowlands, the west component is in the uplands, and this is a general picture of the Joe Dick Road east site. This is the marsh edge here, and here you can see our excavation units in the foreground. On the left-hand side of the screen is a field map of this particular portion of the site. As with the Shapashikum site, we were fortunate to get the original surface of the ground at the Joe Dick Road East site. Here you can see a shot of our excavation units. The excavations are in progress. We're in the process of removing this particular level here. This is the planting surface, and then this darker deposit right here with the reddish-brown deposits on either side. This is the original surface of the ground. As with the Shapashikum site, we have a relatively even burn across the site. So once again, Menominee peoples, they cleared the forest, they spread out branches in order to obtain a really quite even burn. And again, this is really important to control pests, to control insects, to control diseases. The fire itself, the ash is really nutrient rich. It will give you calcium and potassium and phosphorus and other kinds of essential nutrients. The charcoal will provide carbon. Again, if the charcoal is burned in a particular kind of way, it can set up a very favorable environment for microorganisms, which can be very, very important for soil fertility. But you also have to be careful not to put in too much ash. Too much ash will raise the pH too much, and too much ash can also kill microorganisms. So you really have to know what you're doing when you're burning. And just as at the Shapashikum site, ancestral Menominee peoples were able to obtain just the optimal burn for this particular environmental setting. Once again, we can radiocarbon date the charcoal from the original surface of the ground. Here you can see the age, and so the Joe Dick Road east site dates to around 1200 AD. The stratigraphy at the Joe Dick Road site is really quite remarkable, and the reason for this is the comparatively low frequency of earthworms that are here. There are very few earthworms at the Joe Dick Road site because it is located a great distance from the Wolf River Valley. The main avenue for the dispersal of earthworms on the reservation is from the Wolf River itself. Okay. Now, earthworms may be a gardener's best friend, but they're an archaeologist's worst nightmare. And the reason for that has to do with the way that earthworms churn up stratigraphy. So having relatively few earthworms at the Joe Dick Road site allows us to make some really terrific inferences on ancestral Menominee agricultural practices. What you're looking at here is a small stack of sherds on the original surface of the ground. And we interpret these sherds to be part of a consecration rite. These sherds are teeny weeny little pots, sometimes called pinch pots by archaeologists. They're really quite small. They would have fit in the palm of your hand. They might have contained seeds and other kinds of very special items. Shortly after the Chotic road site was burned, these pots were placed on that surface and they were smashed in place. And you can see that there was a couple of different pots here that were smashed in place. Interpreting this as a consecration for the fields is absolutely consonant with Menominee oral traditions. We also get lots of seeds in place within the planting surface. So these are burned seeds in one of the planting surfaces at the Chotic road site. And this allows us to understand how the ancestral Menominee peoples, not just what they were growing, but actually some of their planting strategies within the field itself. When you take a look at the Menominee forest today, there's two things that you'll notice: a great diversity of tree species of different ages, a diverse composition, and a very diverse structure referring to the horizontal and vertical arrangement of the trees. When you take a look and identify the burned seeds that came from the planting surface in the fields, what we see is that ancestral Menominee peoples planted their fields in a way that imitated the structural and compositional diversity of the Menominee forest. So we get sunflower, we get corn, we get squash, but we also get wild seeds such as quinopods within the planting surface itself. All of these plants are of different sizes. They're all planted together. So we have a very diverse composition and structure of our agricultural ecosystem, and it's one that imitates the forest itself. Now, I don't know how you want to measure sustainability, but the degree of environmental impact of farming is directly related to how closely the composition and structure of your fields imitates the local ecosystem. And here we can say, because of these burned seeds in place, that the composition and structure of ancestral Menominee fields mimicked that of the forest itself. The stratigraphy is so good at the Chotic road site that we even get tool marks, and what you're looking at here is a scapula tool mark. So it's really quite a remarkable site. I have a soil science background, and so one of the things I like to do is to analyze soils for their chemistry and take a look at them under the microscope and then try to make some inferences about ancient agricultural practices. What you're looking at here is the results of some of our soil chemical analyses. In this case, taking a look at the element of phosphorus. We like to take a look at phosphorus for a couple of reasons. Number one is that phosphorus is an essential nutrient for crops. Number two, the element phosphorus tends to fix to soil particles so that when we get inputs of phosphorus, many of those inputs, not all, but many of those inputs will stay as a residual signature within the soil itself. What you're looking at here is a graph of soil phosphorus, and on this particular axis, this is the total amount of soil phosphorus in parts per million. On this particular axis is the depth below the surface of the ground. And what we do is we take a look at the soil chemistry by comparing deposits from the raised fields to the deposits of a nearby control profile that's in the same soil environmental setting. So the control profile is shown by the blue diamonds here, and the red squares indicate the values in the corresponding positions from the raised fields. You don't need to be a soil scientist to see that the soil phosphorus signatures are much higher in the raised fields than they are in comparable positions within the control profile. So what does this mean? Well, what this means is that the end result of ancestral Menominee farming was a more fertile soil. Again, phosphorus is a very important element for crop growth, right? So when was the last time that you heard that? The end result of farming is a more fertile soil. This is part of what we have to learn from ancestral Menominee peoples. How did they do this? Can we do this today? Where's all the phosphorus coming from? You're looking at some of the same deposits that were analyzed in the previous slide underneath a microscope. To give you an idea of scale here, what you're looking at here is a piece of grit under the microscope. What you're looking at here would be a sand grain underneath the microscope. Okay, so that'll give you a little bit of an idea of the scale here. Now, this particular slide is from the control profile, and you can see a lot of organic matter, and this organic matter exists as individual particles within the soil itself. Here is a slide from a comparable position from a planting surface in the raised fields. Instead of the organic matter existing as individual particles, you can see it's formed this very complex kind of mass. This mass occasionally has some very bright colors that are within this. These are badly degraded ash crystals. And so what we have here is this very fertile kind of mass that exists within the soils, and this is where the high phosphorus values are coming from. One of the goals of our research is to figure out exactly what ancestral Menominee farmers did in order to create a more fertile soil, and we're still working on that particular problem. Again, we've arbitrarily divided the Joe Dick Road site into east and west components, and the west component is located in the uplands. Here's a general shot of the Joe Dick Road west site, and here's our field map from this particular location. As at the Shapashikum site, the Joe Dick Road site was rebuilt through time. Take a look at the quite remarkable stratigraphy of the excavation unit 9 here. What we have is a buried A horizon, and you can see the radiocarbon ages that we got from charcoal on that particular buried A horizon. Here we have two superimposed pits. Those pits superimpose a buried field. You can see the buried field here and the buried field here. And then there's a later pit that superimposes the earlier pit. Here you can see, again, this buried field. Here's the radiocarbon ages associated with charcoal that we pulled out from that particular buried field. And here you can see the planting surface of the uppermost fields, the ditch from the uppermost fields that are here too. So the way that we interpret this stratigraphy is that as elsewhere, ancestral Menominee peoples, they cleared the vegetation, they laid out branches, they got a relatively even burn, they built the first set of fields, and then this portion of the site was no longer used for agriculture, but instead was used for storage. It became a storage precinct area. Later on, they came and they rebuilt the fields here, moving the planting surfaces slightly, elevating the planting surfaces a bit more. They farmed it for a while, and then once again, this portion of the site was abandoned and was used as a storage pit precinct. Now, that's a pretty remarkable sequence. But here's another equally remarkable part of this entire story. You're on the highest elevation landform in the entire area, right? This is it. This is as high as it gets. How do you bury a field on top of a hill? And the answer is one basket load of soil materials at a time. What got to be really quite interesting is when we took a look at the deposits that were here, they weren't just simply any soil materials. Rather, they were basket loads that were mixtures of materials. So there's a little bit of ash, there's a little bit of the local soil, and then there are some mucks and other deposits taken from low elevation settings that were brought up the hill, mixed together in order to build the uppermost fields that were here. So our excavations tell us that ancestral Menominee peoples built raised fields, let them rest a little bit when it was serving as a storage precinct, farmed the area again, and rested the soils a little bit when the area served as a storage precinct. And we also know from our excavations that they're taking disparate soil materials and they're putting them together. The net result of all this activity is, just as at the Joe Dick Road East site, a more fertile soil at the end of farming. This is the same kind of graph that we looked at before. So here's soil phosphorus on this particular axis. This is depth below surface on this particular axis. The blue diamonds represent the phosphorus values of the nearby control profile, and the red and orange squares represent the phosphorus values from the raised fields themselves. As you can see, the raised fields are far more fertile, have much higher soil phosphorus readings than the control profile. We got the same stratigraphic sequence in the other units that we excavated at the Joe Dick Road West site. A couple of pictures of basically excavations in progress from excavation unit 7. Here you can see the uppermost raised field. We've excavated through the uppermost raised field. Here is the top of a storage pit. Here's that storage pit in cross section. Here. So again, we got the same basic stratigraphic sequence. Now, these storage pits are really quite remarkable. They're 1 to 2 meters in diameter. They're 1 to 2 meters deep. At the Joe Dick Road site, we stopped mapping at 1,000 storage pits. Very clearly, there's a lot of food that's being produced here. Once again, just as at the Joe Dick Road East site, we got burned seeds associated with the planting surface, including a maize cupule that dated to about 1250 AD. As I mentioned previously, ancestral Menominee peoples mixed together disparate soil materials in order to create the uppermost raised field. We excavated units 6 and 7 in tandem. You can see that here, and you can see just how different the deposits are between the two units, even though we're at the same level below the surface of the ground. Here's a close-up unit of excavation 7. We have a very, very thin layer of ash here that's mixed in with some darker materials. When we analyze these materials, myself and people that happen to specialize in plant remains, we were able to identify ash, charcoal, lowland silts, and clay, as well as aquatic grass phytoliths that had been mixed in with the local soil in order to construct this uppermost raised field. Let's take a quick look at the Big Eddy West site. As a reminder, this is the 4th of 6 videos. The Big Eddy site is located on a Pleistocene-aged outwash terrace that overlooks Big Eddy Falls in the central Wolf River Valley. The Big Eddy fields are oriented in many different directions, but all are located on a high elevation surface overlooking marshes, a tributary creek channel, and the Wolf River. Most of the soils on the Menominee Reservation are sandy, acidic, and nutrient poor. Those at the Big Eddy West site are especially so. They're very sandy, very acidic, and have very few nutrients. Given the very poor quality of the soils here, it's not surprising that ancestral Menominee peoples employed a very different burning strategy when constructing the fields. What you're taking a look at here is one of our excavation trenches at the Big Eddy site. So here we have a planting surface. Here we have a ditch, here we have a planting surface, here we have a ditch, here we have a planting surface. So we have these curvilinear ridged fields that are basically coming out towards you in the screen itself. This layer here represents the original surface of the ground. You can see the original surface of the ground here. Here it was disrupted by bioturbation, but it is present just off the photograph itself. What you're looking at here is a close-up picture of this particular area right here. And there's a couple of things that I would like to point out. If you recall, at the Shapashikum site and at the Joe Dick Road site, the soil was oxidized to a reddish brown color during that initial burning. Here you can see that the soil is more of a bluish gray color. In other words, it's reduced. So what this means is that at the Shapashikum and the Joe Dick site, we had an oxidizing environment during the burn itself. We had branches that were spread out relatively evenly. At the Joe Dick and Shapashikum sites, the charcoal flecks are really quite small. It's exactly the opposite at the Big Eddy West site. Here you can see we get large pieces of, very, very large pieces of charcoal. They're really quite abundant. The charcoal has a luster and a kind of a dull luster, a kind of a bluish gray color. And coupled with how the soil is also a kind of a bluish gray color here, this indicates a reducing environment for the actual initial burn here. It's likely that ancestral Menominee peoples burned wet wood, and we're talking about logs or at least very, very large branches in comparison to the smaller branches at Joe Dick and Shapashikum. Why is this important? Well, charcoal that's produced in a reducing environment, charcoal that's incompletely burned, and a lot of these charcoal pieces, not all of them, but a lot of them, when you break them open, are incompletely burned. This is an example of what we call pyrolyzed charcoal, or it's popularly known as biochar today. Now, biochar is very common in the tropics in sandy, acidic, nutrient-poor settings. And the reason for this is that in those tropical settings, uh, biochar sets up a very favorable microenvironment for soil microbes, the kinds of soil microbes that liberate phosphorus, tightly bound phosphorus to soil particles, the kinds of soil microbes that can fix nitrogen from the air. In these kinds of environments, biochar dramatically improves the fertility of the soils. We may have biochar here at the Big Eddy site. To my knowledge, this is the first time that anything looking like biochar has been reported from a site in the upper Midwest. We've sent samples out for identification. Additional samples are going to be taken, and this will be one of our future research questions. The Big Eddy site produced a radiocarbon dates here that dates to around 1600 AD. As you can see on this particular slide, the Big Eddy site is just about the time of European contact. It is also the only one of the sites in this presentation that has produced shell-tempered pottery. But again, Dave Overstreet will talk a lot more about pottery. Sketches of Menominee agriculture during the era of settler colonialism. This is the fifth of 6 videos that make up this presentation. The last archaeology site that we'll take a look at for this presentation is the Waykay Creek site, located in a small tributary stream of the Wolf River. The coming of Europeans and then Americans to Wisconsin dramatically changed Menominee fortunes and livelihoods. Populations crashed due to the introduction of Old World diseases such as chickenpox, measles, smallpox, and so on. The introduction of Old World plants and animals drastically changed New World ecologies, including those in Wisconsin. One example are the earthworms found on the reservation today. Most species of earthworms found on the Menominee Reservation are actually European or Asian species. They certainly have changed soils, and they've certainly changed some of the decomposer communities on the reservation in ways that are detrimental to other components of the environment. Traditional socio-political structures, subsistence economies, and seasonal rounds all changed as Menominee peoples partook in the fur trade. After 3 centuries, and as the fur trade started to decline, European and American settlers came to Wisconsin in increasing numbers. They oftentimes seized native lands and killed or displaced the original inhabitants. The arrival of capitalism and its attendant socio-political and cultural milieu precluded many traditional Menominee ways of caring for nature. Finally, the objective of many U.S. government policies towards American Indians in general, both past and present, as well as to the Menominee, both past and present, were succinctly stated by Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania in the latter part of the 19th century. According to Pratt, it was necessary to kill the Indian in order to save the man. One might expect all traces of traditional Menominee agriculture to have been obliterated by this backdrop of settler colonialism. However, this is not so, as shown by our excavations of the Waykay fields and the fact that both the Menominee and their traditional knowledge are flourishing today. This is a map of Menominee settlements around the time of the treaties, that is the mid-19th century. It shows the location of the Waykay settlement, which was occupied between 1852 and 1865, primarily by members of the Thunderbird clan. One of the interesting things about this map is that you'll notice that most traditional Menominee settlements, are located to the west of the Wolf River, while most Christian settlements are located to the east of the Wolf River. So we can already see the effects of American settlement in the settlement pattern of the Menominee. Now, when I got to the Waykay site, I really didn't know what I was looking at. Here were these really unusual features that were orders of magnitude larger than any raised field that I had ever seen in the upper Midwest or any raised field that had been reported in eastern North America. What was it that we were looking at? Oral traditions very clearly indicated that Waycay was an agricultural settlement. But it wasn't until we put in our excavation units and we learned more from Menominee elders that we were able to put this particular story together. Our excavation units documented a plow zone, and to my knowledge, this is the only raised field that a traditional raised field that's been reported with a plow zone in it. And once we heard more of the stories and did a little bit of historic research, we were able to put these different components together in a way that explained the absolutely enormous relief of the features that we're looking at here. And basically, the story goes like this. As mentioned in the introduction, at the time of the treaties, the U.S. federal government was supposed to provide certain goods and services to the Menominee peoples. Amongst those goods and services was access to agricultural seeds, as well as a plow and a team of oxen with which to prepare their fields. However, in order to gain access to the seed, to the oxen, to the fields, you had to attend Christian religious services. The people living at Waycay managed to get access to the plow and oxen, but instead of preparing the land in Euro-American fashion, that is using the oxen to basically plow up the ground that retained its very flat topography, they used the oxen to build raised fields. Now, through time, there's been a lot of erosion at this site, and the actual relief here has been greatly accentuated by this erosion. Nonetheless, the spacing of the fields is very consistent with the plowing of the land by oxen. So this is a story of cultural resilience, I think, and a very special one. We've also learned a great deal about Menominee agriculture by taking a look at historic photographs, such as this photograph of Soman Jim's house and garden. There's a couple of things to note in this photograph. First of all, notice that not every tree has been cut down in Soman Jim's fields. This suggests a couple of things. Number one, Menominee peoples had shade-adapted varieties of certain kinds of cultigens. There's corn in the background here. There's some beans and other plants in the foreground here. So shade-adapted varieties. Number two, again, if we're thinking about sustainable agriculture, not having to cut down every tree in your plot is obviously going to be good for retaining soils and for maintaining a high species diversity. This is Felix Keesing's unpublished map of farms on the Menominee Reservation in the 1930s. The circles, the filled-in dots here, represent large gardens up to 3 acres in size. The rectangles, the filled-in rectangles here, represent working farms, and the other symbols represent abandoned farms. One of the interesting things about this map is that the Menominee Reservation is host to many, many different microenvironments, and we can see that, well, for a people that supposedly were little acquainted for agriculture, Menominee peoples were able to farm a wide variety of environments. And of course, we continue to learn from Menominee people who continue to grow crops in gardens and farms on the reservation today. This is one of my favorite pictures for a variety of reasons, but this was taken on the day that we found the ashes and the prepared soils on the Joe Dick site. And sometimes your learning has to begin with unlearning. You see, when I was in graduate school, I was taught many things. For example, I was taught that Native peoples never amended soils. I was taught that Native peoples never fallowed ground or had any type of rotational fallow. And all of these things are just simply not true. Um, This picture was taken on the day that we found those deposits on the Joe Dick Road site. We happened to run into Mrs. Arnold. She asked us if we had found anything of interest that particular day, and I was very excited because we had found that mixture of ashes and mucks and so forth at the Joe Dick Road site. And she kind of smiled, and she asked if we would come take a look at her garden. And we went and looked at her garden, and here she had just sprinkled some ashes and charcoal out on the garden. After all, this is what her grandparents taught her to do. So just a delightful day. Well, my friend, it's finally the end. This is the 6th of 6 videos, Ancestral Gifts for a Sustainable Future. I presented the results of some of our research at 4 sites in this presentation, from oldest to youngest, the Shapashikum site, the Joe Dick Road site, the Big Eddy West site, and the Waykay Creek site. In the middle of the 19th century, the U.S. federal government sent a panel of agricultural experts to the Menominee Reservation as part of the treaty negotiations. This panel of agricultural experts was supposed to assess the prospect for Euro-American style agriculture on the reservation. They concluded it is difficult to conceive of locations more illy adapted to the support and wants of a people but little acquainted with farming or the arts of civilization in their language. I hope I've shown in my presentation that this panel of experts could not have been more wrong. Ancestral Menominee peoples developed a number of sophisticated agronomic techniques to deal with some very foreboding farming environments. Yes, the soils on the Menominee Reservation are sandy, nutrient poor, and acidic. Many areas are frequently inundated with water, while others are excessively drained. The climate season is quite short. However, ancestral Menominee peoples developed site-specific burning strategies, site-specific ways of building raised fields. They developed very sophisticated planting strategies that mimic the composition and the structure of the forest itself. And through these techniques and many, many others that I haven't been able to talk about during this particular presentation, ancestral Menominee peoples farmed these foreboding environments right through periods of environmental flux, including the quote-unquote medieval warm period, the quote-unquote little ice age, and of course, the remarkable changes that we're experiencing today with global climate change. Shapashikum is the oldest of the sites that we took a look at today, and they're also the oldest radiocarbon raised fields in the mid-continent. At the Joe Dick site, we have stratigraphic and laboratory evidence that native peoples amended their soils and practiced a form of rotational fallow. At the Big Eddy site, we suspect that ancestral Menominee peoples produced biochar. Any one of these achievements is certainly worth talking about, but all of them together really show the sophistication of ancestral Menominee agriculture. Reconstructing the past is a great deal of fun, but unless it serves the needs of the Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin, we must ask ourselves, what good is it? Today, capital-intensive agriculture produces astonishing volumes of food, but at what social and ecological cost? The people who grow our food are rarely the people who see an adequate return, financial return, on their labor. Genetically modified organisms, agrochemicals, water depletion and water pollution, degraded soils, and the release of greenhouse gases are all wreaking havoc on the environment. Today, it seems as if half the world has an obesity problem and they're watching the other half of the world starve. Meanwhile, astonishing volumes of food are just left to rot. The notion that we must care for nature so that nature can care for us is sadly a fleeting one in places outside Indian country. The modern American diet is terrible for everyone, but it is especially hard on American Indians. This is a graph that Luis Salas and I put together in the late 1990s. It looks at the prevalence of diet-related chronic diseases in American Indians as opposed to the percentage of diet-related chronic diseases for all other races. Diet-related diseases such as hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart failure, stroke, gout, and arthritis are much higher amongst the elders American Indian elders than they are for the comparable demographic cohort for all other races. The spatial flow of capital is everything in a capitalist system. If you want to lift local residents out of poverty, you want dollars to circulate locally, that is, to touch as many local hands as possible. But if you rely on outside sources for the essentials of life, namely for food and energy, your local community is going to become impoverished. This is shown in this very simple diagram here that reflects the local circulation of capital, right? Now, if local people are spending money on food, utilities, clothing, and so forth, and they're doing so off the reservation, then those dollars are leaving the reservation. In 2015, the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin did a food assessment survey, and what they found is that 37% of the people surveyed had experienced at least one day of food insecurity in the month prior to the survey. More than two-thirds do most or all of their shopping off the reservation. There's not much in the way of solar panels and wind farms on the reservation, so people are purchasing their energy from outside the reservation. All the money that's coming in from timber sales or gaming, so much of it is leaving the reservation just to survive, just for daily life, right? So, do we see this in the numbers? Well, we do. In Wisconsin, the median household income in 2017 was about $38,000. In the Menominee Reservation, it's less than half that. And in fact, more than a quarter of all residents live in poverty. I think food production, as well as local energy production, are two of the more important pathways that we can do to lift people out of poverty. Via Campesina is an international peasant farmers organization that was founded in Belgium but became quite active in Latin America in the 1990s. In 1996, Via Campesina issued a food sovereignty manifesto that called for the right of all people to have access to healthy, culturally appropriate food that was locally produced through sustainable methods. In 2015, the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin made their own declaration of food sovereignty, and its principles are listed in the bullet list here. To have access to healthy food, to have foods that are culturally appropriate, to farm, gather, hunt, and fish in ways that are sustainable over the long term, to distribute foods in ways so that people can get what they need to stay healthy, to adequately compensate the people who provide food, and to utilize tribal treaty rights and uphold policies that ensured the continued existence and distribution of traditional foods. The College of the Menominee Nation and the Sustainable Development Institute is also contributing to the food sovereignty movement on the Menominee Reservation. They sponsor a farmers market and have started a seed library. The tribe also now has an agriculture and food systems department headed up by Gary Besaw. They are charged with implementing the Menominee Food Sovereignty Initiative. What is our contribution to all of this? Well, as the tribe ramps up its production of traditional foods, my hope is that our research on the past will contribute to the branding of a Menominee terroir as the oldest organic and sustainable food producers in Wisconsin. Thank you very much. I simply want to say that talking into a microphone is one of the most difficult things I have ever done. This presentation and our research is possible through the generous support of the USDA NEFA program, Menominee Tribal Enterprises, the College of the Menominee, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office of the Menominee, members of the Menominee Language and Culture Committee, and so many Menominee high school and college students. I would like to thank David Overstreet. He's the co-PI for our Menominee Agriculture, a Sustainable Legacy project. Why, when and